In 2 Thessalonians 2:4, referring to the end times apostasy, St. Paul says that the man of sin will seat himself in the temple of God, displaying that he himself is God. This video will show what the temple of God mentioned in the prophecy of 2 Thessalonians 2:4 is, and what it definitely is not. False views on this matter are connected to massive errors in understanding New Testament prophecies, the adoption of absurd theories about the end times, and significant doctrinal errors. This is an extremely important issue. First, the temple of God in the prophecy of 2 Thessalonians 2:4 is certainly not a rebuilt temple of Jerusalem or a Jewish temple, for that would not be the temple of God at all. Sadly, many Protestants and even some misguided people who claim to be Catholic have adopted the position that the man of sin will sit in a rebuilt temple of Jerusalem. But that position is patently false, illogical, and unbiblical. The Church of Christ is the Israel of God, Galatians 6:16. The ceremonies, sacrifices, and rites of Judaism and the Old Law were, before Jesus Christ came, signs that pointed forward to him. But after he came and what was signified by them was present, those ceremonies ceased and were replaced with the sacraments of the New Testament. The destruction of the temple in AD 70 was the definitive sign that Judaism, along with its sacrifices, ceremonies, and rites, is dead and buried, and that it has been replaced by the Church of Jesus Christ. As the Catholic Church has dogmatically taught, to observe or practice the Old Testament rites after the promulgation of the gospel is a mortal sin. St. Thomas Aquinas correctly explained that the ceremonies of the Old Law signified that people were looking forward to the coming of the Messiah. Therefore, to observe Old Testament ceremonies now, after Jesus Christ has come and the gospel has been promulgated, is to pretend that the Messiah has not yet come and fulfilled what those ceremonies signified, and that is heresy and blasphemy. To observe Judaism or the Old Law now is to deny in practice that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. That's why it's gravely sinful to practice Judaism or observe the ceremonies of the Old Law now after the promulgation of the gospel. It's also why any rebuilt temple dedicated to such defunct rites would not be the temple of God. Thus, the temple of God where the man of sin sits is certainly not a rebuilt temple of Jerusalem or a Jewish temple. The false position that the temple of God will be a rebuilt Jewish temple is typically connected to the false doctrine that Jews in the New Testament period are the people of God, or that their religion is, quote, of God. And that is totally wrong. It is in fact a heresy, one widely held in our day. But the Bible is very clear. True Christians, not unbelieving Jews, are Israel and the people of God. 1 Peter 2:9 demolishes the notion that any group other than the church are the people of God when it says of true Christians, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession." As we can see, Christians, not Jews, are the chosen race / the people of God. Colossians 3:12 sets forth the same truth. In fact, every time the term chosen is used in the New Testament, it refers to Jesus Christ or to Christians. It never refers to Jews or to a specific physical race. God's chosen people are not those who have physically descended from Abraham or joined themselves to those physical descendants, but rather those who have been spiritually regenerated in Christ and maintain his true faith. Galatians 3:16 informs us that the promises were made to Abraham and to his seed, and that Abraham's seed is not many but one, that is, Jesus Christ. Galatians 3:29 then tells us that if you are Christ's, you are Abraham's seed. That is Scripture's infallible teaching on the seed of Abraham. Nothing could be more clear. This is also why in Acts 3:23, St. Peter, speaking of Jesus Christ, true God and true man, says, "And it shall be that every soul who does not listen to that prophet shall be completely cut off from the people." The Bible teaches that Jews who don't accept Jesus Christ are completely cut off from the people of God. Thus, any house or temple they would construct would not be the temple of God. There is an abundance of additional scriptural evidence that could be cited to further prove that Christians, not Jews, are Israel and the people of God. Since we're discussing the term Temple of God in the prophecy of 2 Thessalonians 2:4, it should be noted that numerous commentators have pointed out that in his epistles, including in 1 and 2 Thessalonians, St. Paul takes terms that were originally reserved for Israel and applies them to the church. St. Paul teaches that the church has taken the position of Israel. Many passages prove that those outside of Jesus Christ and his church are not of God. They are not Israel, and they have no part with him. They need to be converted to the true faith of Christ to be part of the Israel of God. Hence, any non-Christian or Jewish temple built in Jerusalem, including one that purports to be a restoration of the ancient temple, would not be the temple of God. It would just be another temple of the devil dedicated to a false religion. This is also why attempts to rebuild the Jerusalem temple have failed and even been prevented by miraculous events. Consider, for example, the attempt made in the year 363 by the Roman Emperor Julian the Apostate. Many people aren't familiar with the miraculous events that halted the effort to rebuild the Jerusalem temple, even though these events were well known in the early church. Julian the Apostate, an enemy of Christianity, desired to rebuild the Jerusalem temple in the year 363 because its destruction rendered Jews unable to actually practice the Old Testament religion. The obliteration of their temple in accord with Jesus Christ's life and prophecies was a divine proof that the Messiah had come and that Christianity had replaced Judaism. Well, it's a fact, confirmed by many sources, that as Julian's men worked to rebuild the temple, miraculous fireballs burst forth in the area, the earth shook, crosses appeared on the clothes of men, and people were killed, causing the entire effort to be abandoned. This is not just some legend, it's a well-documented historical occurrence. These extraordinary and miraculous events, which prevented the reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem, were recorded by St. Gregory Nazianzen, St. Ambrose, St. John Chrysostom, the early church historians Socrates and Sozomen, and others. They were even confirmed by the pagan historian Ammianus Marcellinus, a friend of Julian the Apostate. He stated, quote, "Terrifying balls of flame kept bursting forth near the foundations of the temple, and made the place inaccessible to the workmen, some of whom were burned to death. And since in this way the element of fire persistently repelled them, the enterprise halted." End quote. These extraordinary events, which stopped the construction of the temple, were so well documented that St. Ambrose used them as an argument in his letter to the Emperor Gratian in 380. He would not have done so if they were not well-established facts. The miraculous events through which God intervened to prevent the reconstruction of the Jerusalem temple are another powerful indication that the temple of God in New Testament end times prophecy is not a rebuilt temple of Jerusalem. Even if one granted for the sake of argument that God would allow a structure purporting to be a restoration of the Jerusalem temple to be completed, the facts we've covered demonstrate that such a structure would certainly not be the temple of God, but the temple of a false religion. That's why the 4th century doctor of the church, St. John Chrysostom, correctly described Jewish synagogues in the New Testament period, not as houses of God, but as the lodging places of demons. He considered synagogues to be houses of demons and said they are less deserving of honor than an inn. This is consistent with the Bible's teaching in Revelation 3:9 that Jews who reject Jesus Christ are not part of a religion of God, but members of the synagogue of Satan. Like others outside the church, they need to be converted to the true faith of Christ to be saved. The meaning of Revelation 3:9 is that Jews who reject Jesus Christ are not true Judeans or Jews. They are not Israel because true Christians alone are Israel. Unbelieving Jews are part of the synagogue of Satan. Only those who belong to Christ are Abraham's seed. To suppose, therefore, that the temple of God in 2 Thessalonians 2:4 will be a Jewish temple is actually to equate a lodging of demons and the synagogue of Satan with what is of God, which is of course quite wrong. Further proof that the temple of God referred to in 2 Thessalonians 2:4 has nothing to do with Judaism is found in considering the meaning of the temple of God in St. Paul's epistles. Even when the Jerusalem temple was still standing, St. Paul made it clear to the Corinthians that Christians had replaced the Jerusalem temple as the temple of God. For example, quote, "Do you not know that you are God's temple? For God's temple is holy, and you are that temple." And, "What accord has Christ with Belial? Or what portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God." According to the New Testament, the true Christians are the temple of God. The Church of Christ has inherited the position of Israel and replaced the Old Testament temple, which was destroyed almost 2,000 years ago, as a divine sign of the transfer of all things from Old Testament Judaism to the Church of Christ. In fact, the phrase temple of God is used by St. Paul 4 times besides in 2 Thessalonians 2:4. In every case it refers to the church. The identification of the church as the temple of God is found repeatedly in the New Testament, including in the book of Ephesians and 1 Peter. The temple of God in 2 Thessalonians 2:4 is not a rebuilt temple of Jerusalem. Moreover, the temple of God is definitely not a temple built by the man of sin or Antichrist, for then it would be his own temple. In that case, it would be a naas diabolou, that is, a temple of the devil, and not naas theou, the temple of God. In fact, in 2 Thessalonians 2:4, the definite article, that is, the word meaning the, is found both before the word temple and the word God. So a very literal translation of the Greek phrase would be that the man of sin seats himself in, quote, the temple of the God, end quote. Thus, the temple referred to in the prophecy, which is the temple of the God, is not a temple built by the man of sin or the Antichrist. No, the temple of God pertains to the Church of Jesus Christ. Since the prophecy of 2 Thessalonians 2:4 says that the man of sin will sit in the temple of God, and it is of course impossible for a person to physically sit in the spiritual entity of the church, the prophecy indicates that the man of sin will sit in the primary physical structure of the Church of Jesus Christ. He will sit in a building that has been known as, and could be rightly considered to be, the universal temple of Christianity. Prophecies like this about the temple of God could of course find no fulfillment in a world which imagines Protestantism to be Christianity, since non-Catholics who claim to be Christian have no universally recognized temple of God. For them, nothing stands out as a universally acknowledged Christian temple of God in which the man of sin could sit. That's why so many of them in desperation have opted for the patently false rebuilt Temple of Jerusalem idea. Even many non-Catholics who reject the notion that Jews are the people of God in the New Testament have adopted the position that a rebuilt Jewish temple will be the temple of prophecy, for they realize that the prophecy refers to the man of sin sitting in a physical structure that is identified as the temple of God, and there is nothing that could possibly be considered the universal temple of God in non-Catholic, quote, Christianity. Their erroneous view on what the temple of God means leads to absurd theories about the reconstruction of the Jewish temple and the resumption of defunct Jewish rites, which they believe must happen for end times prophecies to be fulfilled. What the prophecy about the man of sin sitting in the temple of God should tell them, however, is that Protestantism is not true Christianity, for in true Christianity there has been a universally recognized temple. The universally recognized temple in true Christianity is the Vatican in Rome, and more specifically, it is St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. St. Peter's Basilica is the temple of God, as we will see. This temple was built on the very spot where St. Peter, the first pope, was buried. The construction of this temple on St. Peter himself thus served as a fitting symbol for the church, for Jesus Christ founded the universal church upon St. Peter. He identified St. Peter as the rock. He gave him the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and he entrusted him with his flock. So just as Jesus Christ built his universal church upon St. Peter, it was fitting that the most prominent physical structure and temple in that church, St. Peter's Basilica, would also be built on St. Peter himself, that is, directly over his grave. In fact, think of it this way. Scripture teaches that the church of God equals the temple of God. Well, Scripture also teaches that the church of God was built upon St. Peter. It follows, therefore, that the temple of God would also be built upon St. Peter, and that's exactly what happened with St. Peter's Basilica, which was built right over St. Peter's grave. That's another indication that St. Peter's Basilica is the temple of God mentioned in St. Paul's prophecy. And as our videos, including Babylon Has Fallen, have shown, in our very own day we have seen the apocalyptic prophecies about Babylon and the beast stunningly fulfilled at the very spot of that temple, St. Peter's Basilica. Now, before we cover all the other evidence that St. Peter's Basilica is the temple of God mentioned in the prophecy of 2 Thessalonians 2:4, consider this. On December 23, 1929, Pope Pius XI issued his encyclical, Quinquagesimo Ante. This encyclical mentions and celebrates the 1929 Lateran Treaty. As our material explains, the Lateran Treaty, signed on February 11, 1929, created the Vatican City-State, which granted the claimants to the papacy a brand new kingdom in Rome, which is the end-times Roman kingdom prophesied in the Apocalypse. The 7 priest kings of the Vatican City-State, starting with Pope Pius XI, are clearly the 7 Roman kings mentioned in apocalyptic prophecy. The prophecies fit them in stunning detail, such as the European Union beast arising when 5 are fallen, the 7th king reigning for a short time, the Whore of Babylon, that is, the end-times post-Vatican II counter-church, being associated with what eventually happened in the Vatican City-State, one of the signs of Revelation 18:2 occurring on the anniversary of the signing of the Lateran Treaty, February 11th, and it happened just a matter of hours after the 7th king of the Vatican City-State formally announced the resignation of his kingship on a February 11th, and much more, as our material covers. In fact, it's very interesting that Pius XI, the first of the 7 kings, not only received his kingship on a February 11th in 1929, but on Monday, February 11th of that year. And Antipope Benedict XVI, the 7th king, announced his resignation on Monday, February 11th, 2013. And the man who followed the 7 Roman kings, Antipope Francis, is not only not a validly ordained priest, having been, quote, ordained in the invalid new rite of ordination, and therefore he cannot be a priest-king of the Vatican City-State's sacerdotal or priestly monarchy, but he also openly rejects all aspects of kingship, indicating that the 7 kings of the Vatican City-State from Pope Pius XI through Antipope Benedict XVI were indeed the 7 Roman kings of prophecy. Now, in the very year that the Vatican City-State was created, and in a document that discusses this new kingdom in Rome, Pope Pius XI says the following about St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. Quote, "Such a great multitude convened in the Petrine sacred precincts on the 1st of December, that we have perhaps never seen the most ample temple so packed." End quote. Pope Pius XI, the first king of the Vatican City-State, refers to St. Peter's Basilica as, quote, "the most ample temple," end quote. The word he uses in the Latin is edem, the accusative form of the Latin word edes, which means temple. In fact, eideis is a word that could be used to translate the Greek word naos into Latin. This not only proves that St. Peter's Basilica has officially been referred to as the Temple, but it's a providential indication in the very year the Lateran Treaty was signed and in a document that discusses the New Kingdom in Rome, that St. Peter's Basilica is the temple of God in St. Paul's prophecy. That's why in our very own day, the apocalyptic prophecies have been fulfilled at that very spot. For example, Revelation 18:2 prophesies that Babylon the Great will fall and become the prison of every unclean bird and beast. As our video showed, that part of the prophecy was strikingly fulfilled in the Vatican on December 8, 2015. On that day, the Vatican II sect held an unprecedented light show called Fiat Lux, on the 50th anniversary of the ending of Vatican II. During this light show, the images and sounds of all kinds of unclean birds and beasts were projected onto St. Peter's Basilica, corresponding exactly to the prophecy in Revelation 18:2 about how Babylon the Great has become the prison of every unclean bird and beast. In fact, as the video covers, the prophecy uses the word phulake in Greek to describe how Babylon has fallen and become the prison or cage of every unclean bird and beast. And the pillars in front of St. Peter's Basilica look just like prison bars, so that when the images of the animals and birds were projected onto St. Peter's Basilica during the light show, they appeared to be in a prison or a cage exactly as the prophecy states. That means that the prophecy's fulfillment was intertwined with the specific features of St. Peter's Basilica, the Temple of God. The light show on St. Peter's Basilica was a stunning and direct fulfillment of what's prophesied in Revelation 18:2, and the event symbolized the fall of the city of Rome into uncleanness and apostasy in the final days, as a result of the takeover of the Temple of God and Rome by the Vatican II anti-popes and their end-times counter-church, the Vatican II sect, which is what the prophecies about the Whore of Babylon in general are about. Further, our video showed how the other part of Revelation 18:2, concerning how Babylon has fallen to demons and every unclean spirit, was also stunningly fulfilled at the very same spot, St. Peter's Basilica, on the day that the seventh king of the Vatican City-State, Antipope Benedict XVI, announced that he would resign February 11, 2013. The sign that Babylon had fallen to demons and every unclean spirit was lightning. The double lightning strike at the top of St. Peter's Basilica on a day critical to the end times prophecies. This corresponds exactly to what Jesus said in Luke 10:18, that he saw Satan fall as lightning. And when you compare the contexts of Luke 10:17-20 and Revelation 18:2, the parallel is absolutely undeniable. Both passages deal with demons, unclean spirits, and Satan falling to a particular place. Luke 10:18 tells us that the sign that Satan fell once was lightning. It makes perfect sense, therefore, that the sign that Babylon has fallen to demons and to every unclean spirit, in other words, that Satan fell twice, once in the form of demons and once in the form of every unclean spirit, was lightning. And the fulfillment of the prophecy gets even more specific and amazing because the dome of St. Peter's Basilica was built precisely above the high altar and the bronze canopy marking St. Peter's grave. So the dome marks the exact spot where St. Peter is located, and 1 Peter 5:13 infallibly defines Babylon's precise location as St. Peter's Church and the place where St. Peter is located. Thus, when lightning struck the very top of the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, fulfilling the prophecy about Babylon having fallen to demons and every unclean spirit, it was hitting the exact spot with pinpoint accuracy of St. Peter's grave, the precise location of Babylon according to Scripture. That means that we can explain and demonstrate how every single word of the prophecy of Revelation 18:2 was fulfilled at that very spot, St. Peter's Basilica. We could also go through many other verses in the Apocalypse and show how what has transpired in Rome and at St. Peter's Basilica in our day fulfills those prophecies. St. Peter's Basilica is a focal point in the prophecies because it is the temple of God. When St. Paul described it in 2 Thessalonians 2:4, he described it not as the temple of the devil, but as the temple of God, because the Catholic Church is the one true church of Jesus Christ, outside of which there is no salvation. All the other, quote, churches are false. The Catholic Church is the one true church, but in the final days, in the final apostasy, as part of the great deception, God has allowed his temple and the buildings of his church to be taken over by a counter-church led by heretical anti-popes. The Catholic Church still exists in a remnant of traditional Catholics. To be a true Catholic and therefore a true Christian, one must be a traditional Catholic. This video is the first part of a longer presentation on the Temple of God in prophecy. Stay tuned for the other parts, and please consult our related videos on prophecy and the apocalypse, such as, among other things, the videos Babylon Has Fallen, and the Antichrist Identified. The Antichrist Identified covers in detail the other part of 2 Thessalonians 2:3-4, about the man of sin who reclined across from and raised himself above everything that is called God or every object of worship at the signature event of the prophesied apostasy.